Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. With that, we will have the Pledge of Allegiance. Would the gentleman from Arizona lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Without objection, our colleague, Mr. Biggs from Arizona, will be able to participate in the hearing today for the purpose of questioning the witness if a member yields him time for that purpose. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. I thank our witness for being here today. The Civil Rights Division is responsible for the enforcement of civil rights statutes enacted by Congress and related constitutional guarantees. This is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. I, too, in a previous life served in the Department of Justice, having served as Special Assistant United States Attorney in the Eastern District of Texas. My job there, as the witness, my colleagues know, was to equally enforce the law. My grandfather was the Chief of Police in Sweetwater, Texas. His job was to equally enforce the law. My grandmother was the first woman elected county clerk in Nolan County, Texas, after my grandfather passed away from cancer when my dad was 7 years old. Her job was to equally enforce the law. Justice is blind, and we must follow the facts wherever they may take us. Like all components of the Justice Department, the Civil Rights Division is expected to do the same, equally enforce the law. Unfortunately, under the Biden administration, this has not always been the case. The Civil Rights Division has fixed its sight, for example, on those charged with protecting us, police departments, often harassing these departments to the point that they cannot do their jobs. There have been a series of investigations: Minneapolis, Louisville, Phoenix, Mount Vernon, New York, Louisiana State Police, New York City Police Department Special Victims Division, Maryland Department of State Police, Worcester, Massachusetts Police Department, Memphis Police, Trenton, New Jersey, Lexington, Mississippi. 11 times over the last 2 years, we've seen a significant disparity. There are just a few examples of how the DOJ Civil Rights Division has targeted those who protect our communities. It's not to say there are not circumstances meriting review, but in the midst of rising crime, plummeting police recruiting, open borders, mountains of fentanyl, DOJ is prioritizing investigations of small to mid-sized police departments. Under President Biden, DOJ has opened 11 pattern or practice investigations into police departments throughout the country, compared to just one under the previous administration. This combined with fairly radical views that we'll talk about with the witness earlier about defunding the police in the past, which raises concerns about the intent of such investigations, especially at a time when police are demoralized, following the defund the police movement and crime wave that has followed. The division's activities have also all too often amounted to using the law to advantage or disadvantage certain states and individuals. For example, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances, or FACE Act, prohibits threats of force, obstruction, and property damage intended to interfere with reproductive health care services. This law protects abortion clinics, pregnancy resource centers, and houses of worship alike. However, the division's prosecutions under the FACE Act show a significant bias toward prosecuting FACE Act violations involving abortion clinics, particularly the situation involving Mark Houck, who was charged under the FACE Act for protecting his young son from a belligerent abortion activist. On May 2nd, 2022, a draft copy of the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization was leaked to the press. This leak gave rise to widespread demonstrations and attacks on pro-life facilities. In fact, following the leak, more than 100 pro-life facilities were vandalized or damaged, including by arson. 218 Catholic churches have been attacked since the Dobbs decision was leaked, according to Catholic Vote. According to the Family Research Council, there were 57 pro-abortion acts of hostility against churches from January 22 to September 22. And in the first quarter of fiscal 23, there were 69 incidents of hostility toward churches. In the face of this increase, you would expect Civil Rights Division to step up and protect the civil rights of these Americans, but there was not. In 2022, the department brought 26 prosecutions under the FACE Act. All of them involved alleged incidents at abortion clinics. In 23, the department has identified for the committee one prosecution of 4 individuals in Florida who spray-painted threats on pregnancy resource centers in the state. This marked the first time in American history that the FACE Act was used against pro-abortion protesters. This questionable use of resources is further illustrated by other activities of the division. In 2021, the department began a lawsuit against the state of Georgia alleging a new election law was enacted with the purpose of denying or abridging the right of Black Georgians to vote on account of their race or color. The problem is that's just not true, and the court's decisions in that case to date have borne that out. Recently, the court refused to block several provisions of the law while the litigation continues. Notably, the court found that the department has not shown that any of the provisions have a disparate impact on Black voters. Quite simply, the facts on the ground do not match the allegations in the department's lawsuit. While the department is devoting resources to this politically motivated lawsuit, it is missing in action when constitutional rights are violated. In September of this year, New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham issued a public health order banning the otherwise lawful carrying of firearms in certain jurisdictions in the state. This order was plainly unconstitutional under the 2nd and 14th Amendments and the Supreme Court's precedents. Despite this plain violation of American rights, the Civil Rights Division was nowhere to be found. An advocacy group, not the department, had to bring a lawsuit to overturn the order. The division failed to file an amicus brief or even a statement of interest to protect Americans' Second Amendment rights. More recently, the Civil Rights Department appears to be standing idly by while Jewish Americans have their civil rights violated by radical pro-Palestinian protesters. Since Hamas's cowardly October 7th attack in which it murdered innocent Israelis, raped women, and kidnapped babies, rampant anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head on American college campuses and throughout major American cities. Just this weekend, pro-Palestinian protesters in Philadelphia protested outside of Goldie, a Jewish-owned falafel restaurant with a location less than a mile away from Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. The division must return to the nonpartisan work of protecting the rights of all Americans. I would note that there is an ongoing list of anti-Semitic threats and violence throughout the West. Anti-Semites spray Montreal Jewish schools in bullets, attacks on AIPAC president's home in LA investigated as hate crime. Burbank police search for a suspect that spray painted swastikas on synagogue. Burn in Hell Jewish Center at University of Florida vandalized with anti-Semitic graffiti. Cornell cancels classes after student arrested for anti-Semitic threats of murder and rape. FBI investigating after synagogue desecrated with anti-Israel, anti-Semitic graffiti. That's 8 of literally pages of examples of anti-Semitic acts in the wake of October 7th. And it is notable that there has been basically silence. So it is true the division must return to the nonpartisan work of protecting the rights of all Americans, not just those that it favors. I look forward to hearing this morning how that will happen. I will now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for her opening statement.
Thank you. Assistant Attorney General Clark, I want to welcome you to the Judiciary Committee and this very important oversight hearing to help the committee and the American public understand the critical role that the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice plays in protecting the fundamental rights and freedoms of all Americans. This hearing is particularly important since your predecessor refused the committee's request for an oversight hearing amidst the Trump administration's efforts to weaponize the Department of Justice in a way that was unprecedented in the history of this great nation. Under that administration, we saw members of the Department of Justice leadership acting as the president's personal attorneys, repeating election disinformation, withdrawing support for voting rights and other civil rights enforcement, and reversing course on decades of work to ensure that law enforcement agencies protect the rights of all Americans. And of course, under that administration, we saw the normalization of hate speech, chaos, and political violence, which is tearing apart so many of our communities today. That's why it's so important that we understand the critical role of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division in combating civil rights violations and securing our fundamental freedoms, and what Congress needs to do to support that mission at this time. It's worth remembering that Congress explicitly created the Civil Rights Division as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1957 to protect the voting rights of Black Americans and other minorities. The very genesis of the Civil Rights Division was rooted in the federal effort to protect voting rights and reflected the belief that in a democracy, the right to vote is the foundation upon which all other rights and freedoms ultimately rest. These core civil rights and freedoms include the right to cast a vote in a free and fair election, regardless of race, the right to be free from discrimination in employment, housing, and education, and the right to be free from violence based on hate. And I look forward to how the Civil Rights Division has renewed its commitment to these principles under its current leadership. Under the Trump administration, we saw the Civil Rights Division abdicate its responsibility to enforce many voting rights and other civil rights protections. So I'm heartened to see a renewed focus by the division on vigorous civil rights enforcement. Understanding that the right to cast a vote in a free and fair election is the foundation of all other rights, I appreciate the division's renewed focus on voting rights, taking action in over 40 voting rights matters since January 2021, ranging from voting-related enforcement actions to filing statements of interest in numerous private enforcement actions, including 2 in Pennsylvania. But we continue to need vigorous enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, as we've seen a tsunami of restrictive voting laws enacted by states over the past 3 years, with the potential to impact the 2024 election. Of course, much of this legislative activity stems from the Supreme Court's erosion of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 through a series of decisions beginning with Shelby County versus Holder and continuing with Brovanovich versus Democratic National Committee. These decisions have made it harder and more resource-intensive for both the Civil Rights Division and other Voting Rights Act plaintiffs to prevail in enforcement actions. But there is a solution, of course. That is that Congress must act. Congress must respond to these misguided decisions by reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act and updating the guardrails of our democratic republic to respond to 21st century threats. We must pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would reinvigorate the Voting Rights Act and ensure full funding for the Civil Rights Division to deploy more resources to enforce voting rights protections. The Civil Rights Division also bears responsibility for enforcing federal hate crime laws at a time when over the past 7 years we've seen an explosion of hate speech and political violence, whether directed towards racial or ethnic minorities, women and LGBTQ+ persons, or members of religious groups. All across the country, communities have been impacted by hate incidents as they've trended upwards. Statistics compiled by the FBI show that last year, even with imperfect reporting, law enforcement agencies reported over 11,000 hate crime incidents. Over 59% of those victims were targeted because of their race or ethnicity, another 17.3% were targeted based on their religion, and another 17% were targeted because of their sexual orientation. Of course, in the charged environment surrounding Hamas's terrorist attack on October 7th and Israel's military response to the attack, we've seen increasing reports of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, including incidents of potential hate crimes. Also, for decades, the Civil Rights Division has played an important role in helping law enforcement agencies to keep their communities safe and uphold the rule of law while protecting the civil rights of all citizens. One of the tools for doing this is to work with communities to address patterns and practices of violations in law enforcement, a tool that was abandoned by the Trump Department of Justice, and I look forward to hearing what progress has been made in this area. Again, thank you, Assistant Attorney General Clark, for being with us and updating us on the work of the division and what Congress needs to do to assist the division in that work. Thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement, should he care to give one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to begin by thanking Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark for appearing before the subcommittee today. Unfortunately, it has been several years since we have had the opportunity to question the head of the Department of Civil Rights Division, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, because General Clark's immediate predecessor during the Trump administration never appeared before us. In a sense, I don't blame the department for its evasion at the time, because back then it had nothing good to report to us, as it practically abdicated its responsibility to vigorously enforce our nation's critical civil rights laws. I'm pleased, however, that under the Biden administration and under Assistant Attorney General Clark's leadership, the division is once again taking its role seriously. That means protecting Americans from a nationwide effort to undermine the right to vote, working with local communities to investigate and resolve patterns and practices of unconstitutional conduct in law enforcement agencies, addressing the disturbing rise in hate crimes across the country, and combating discrimination in all forms, whether it be in employment, housing, education, or elsewhere. On all of these critical issues and many others that impact millions of Americans, the dedicated staff of the Civil Rights Division works tirelessly to ensure that all Americans, regardless of their race, religion, sex, national origin, disability, or sexual orientation, are treated equally under the law. Thank you for your efforts in leading this vital department. Excuse me. At top of mind for me today is the recent rise in anti-Semitism and the general rise in hate crimes and other forms of illegal discrimination that has transpired over the past several years. According to the most recent data compiled by the FBI for the year 2022 and the testimony of federal law enforcement officials, there's been a significant documented increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes and discrimination. According to FBI data, even before Hamas's brutal terrorist attack on October 7th, anti-Semitism was on the rise. In 2022, there were 2,042 reported incidents based on religion, and more than half of these were driven by anti-Jewish bias. During recent testimony before the Senate, FBI Director Christopher Wray stated that the threat of anti-Semitism, quote, is reaching in some way sort of historic levels, and that was in part because the Jewish community is targeted by terrorists really across the spectrum, including foreign terrorist organizations and domestic violent terrorist extremists. Director Wray went on to say that the FBI statistics would indicate that for a group that represents only about 2.4% of the American public, Jewish Americans account for something like 60% of all religious-based hate crimes. But it is not just the Jewish community that is experiencing a rise in hate. In the weeks since the October 7th attacks, there have been tragic incidents of Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate across the country, including the recent shooting of 3 Palestinian American students in Vermont and the murder of a 6-year-old Muslim child in Illinois. Now, unfortunately, hate crimes rooted in race, ethnicity, or ancestry continue to remain the most common. According to that same FBI data, there were 6,557 reported race-motivated incidents in 2022. And the number of anti-Black incidents was more than 3 times higher than the next highest racial or ethnic category. Additionally, FBI data also shows a disturbing trend of increasing instances of violence against the transgender and gender nonconforming community. As we all know, while statistics can help us quantify and understand the magnitude of the problem, they cannot fully convey the damage that bias-motivated crimes inflict upon our communities. General Clark, I cannot emphasize enough how vulnerable the Jewish community in America is feeling at this moment, especially now that the October 7th attack appears to have led to an explosive rise in anti-Semitism both at home and abroad. And I know without a doubt that every other community I just mentioned shares that same sense of vulnerability following similar hate-motivated crimes. If unaddressed, hate crimes send the message to every member of a community that you are not a real person and therefore are undeserving of the law's protection. Addressing that feeling of vulnerability is, of course, the point of hate crimes enforcement, to provide not only justice for the victim, but for the entire community. So I'm heartened to hear that under your leadership, the Civil Rights Division has brought over 100 hate crime-related cases and secured numerous convictions, including against the perpetrators of the attacks in Buffalo, Pittsburgh, and El Paso. That is why I also believe it is crucial for Congress to provide sufficient tools and resources to the Civil Rights Division so that it can effectively address this rise in hate, as well as to carry out its mission to remedy illegal discrimination in voting, employment, education, public accommodations, and government-funded programs and services. In that vein, if I may, General Clark, I would offer a few words of advice to you and to those members of the public who may be following today's hearing. Don't be distracted by the Republican sideshow fueled by their conspiracy-minded allies in their conservative media echo chamber, of which we have already heard a preview today. Under your leadership, the Civil Rights Division is properly focused on the enforcement of rights that are essential to the functioning of our diverse democratic society. After all, if you can be attacked with impunity because of your religion, denied the right to vote because of your race, fired from your job because of your sex, or prohibited from receiving an education because you are transgender, the fundamental rights and values enshrined in the Constitution are not worth the paper they are written on. I look forward to our distinguished witness's testimony, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member for his statement. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. We will now introduce today's witness, the Honorable Kristen Clark. Ms. Clark is the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. She was sworn in on May 25th, 2021. We welcome our witness and thank her for appearing today. We will begin by swearing you in. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Let the record reflect that the witness has answered in the affirmative. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony. Ms. Clark, you may begin.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Roy, Ranking Member Scanlon, Ranking Member Nadler, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. Protecting civil rights is essential to the Department of Justice. In fact, the department was created in 1870 in part to confront the Ku Klux Klan and others who used terror and violence to prevent Black people from exercising their civil and constitutional rights. Nearly 100 years later, Congress gave new energy to this work by enacting legislation that established the Civil Rights Division and empowered it to protect the civil rights of every person in America. Our work remains vital as we continue, sadly, to see acts of bigotry, violence, and discrimination in many aspects of life. The division combats these harms by enforcing the Constitution and the protections enshrined in law by Congress. We work to ensure that every eligible American has voice in our democracy by confronting voting discrimination. And we work to advance equal opportunity in employment, housing, education, and more. We safeguard the rights of people with disabilities, and we defend the civil rights of those who defend our nation in the armed forces, both past and present. We work to vindicate the rights of sexual assault survivors and people who experience sexual harassment on campuses, in workplaces, in housing, and in jails and prisons. We work to ensure that law enforcement personnel carry out their jobs lawfully and without bias. This work includes prosecutions of officers who abuse their power, including officers tied to the tragic deaths of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, and Tyree Nichols in Memphis. Work that has particular urgency today is our response to bias-motivated violence. FBI data show that reported hate crimes are at the highest level in more than a decade. Black people remain the group most frequently targeted by hate crimes, and crimes motivated by anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and bias against the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity have also climbed in number. In the weeks following the devastating October 7th attacks in Israel and ensuing violence in the Middle East, we've seen an alarming rise in acts of hate in our neighborhoods, on our campuses, and in our streets. We know that too many communities are living in fear, and we've all seen the horrors that result from hate. The Charleston 9, the El Paso 23, the Tree of Life 11, the Buffalo 10, the Club Q 5, the Jacksonville 3. Each of these tragedies offers a bleak testament to the death, pain, and trauma that can flow from bigotry and hatred. And so the division's top priority is to investigate and prosecute unlawful acts of hate. Since January of 2021, the division has charged more than 105 defendants in more than 95 cases for committing hate crimes. And during that same period, we obtained more than 90 convictions. For example, the division secured a guilty verdict against the man who killed 11 people and critically wounded 7 others at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. The division also secured a conviction of the man who killed 23 and wounded 22 more at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, victims targeted because of their Hispanic identity. And we secured convictions of the 3 men responsible for the racially motivated killing of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. Hate crimes are message crimes. The perpetrators not only target their direct victims, but also seek to instill fear in the victim's community. But our prosecutions send a louder and more powerful message. that hate crimes will not be tolerated in our democracy, that perpetrators will be punished and held accountable, and that the communities targeted will be safeguarded by the federal government. As I close, I want to recognize the hundreds of dedicated public servants in the Civil Rights Division who carry out this critical work. Their commitment inspires me each day, and I'm honored to represent them here today. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. The chair will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Clark, in a June 2020 op-ed, you wrote, quote, "I advocate for defunding policing operations that have made African Americans more vulnerable to police violence and contributed to mass incarceration while investing more in programs and police policies that address critical community needs." Since that time, in summer of 2020, there have been significant drops in recruiting police nationwide, significant evidence of morale dropping for our police officers and communities across the country. Simple statement, do you stand behind that statement in the op-ed that you wrote in the summer of 2020, advocating, quote, for defunding policing operations? Microphone, ma'am.
The Justice Department fully supports funding and supporting our law enforcement.
Well, but my
officers.
question was different than that. I mean, you penned it, and you are the head of the Civil Rights Division, and you penned the op-ed in the summer of 2020, in the midst of significant unrest around the country, where our law enforcement community was dealing with significant attacks on them. And you wrote, "I advocate for defunding policing operations." Do you stand by that statement?
I've not advocated for defunding law enforcement. At the Justice Department, we allocate millions of dollars by way of our Office of Justice Programs, COPS Office, Office of Violence Against Women, to support law enforcement.
The time to answer on the question. The question is just simple. You wrote that statement. Do you stand behind that statement, or do you now repudiate that statement?
I have not advocated for defunding law enforcement, Chairman, and I appreciate the difficult jobs that our law enforcement officers do each day to keep us safe, and believe it's important that they have the resources to carry out their jobs.
Well, importantly, Black Americans make up 36% of violent crime victims, but only 14% of the population. Do you think defunding the police, as you wrote in an op-ed in June of 2020, it's in writing, do you think defunding the police makes African Americans, Black community, more vulnerable to violence?
I support ensuring that law enforcement have the resources and support needed to carry out their jobs. Public safety is a top priority for all of us.
I would note that the City of Austin and the Travis County DA's office sent you a joint letter just, I think, yesterday or maybe the day before, announcing that 17 of the 21 Austin Police Department officers indicted for alleged excessive force violations between May 29 and May 31 in that summer of unrest were cleared. We had 17 law enforcement officers who were indicted by the local DA, and then they were suddenly cleared. But then they sent a letter the same day requesting that the DOJ Civil Rights Division investigate the Austin Police Department, despite the fact the Austin Police Department had been a model for the Department of Justice how to engage in the use of force. My question for you is, will you investigate the district attorney for having indicted 17 police officers and then suddenly walking away for a political safe phasing rather than investigating the police department?
I'm not aware of that correspondence. I'm happy to look into this matter further, Chairman.
Well, I would look forward to working with your office to do that. It's extraordinarily concerning. In your written testimony, you mentioned the DOJ has prosecuted FACE Act violations involving both abortion providers and pregnancy resource centers. Can you tell us how many FACE Act cases have been filed since it was enacted in 1994?
So the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act is an important law. We apply it even-handedly. I don't have statistics on the number of cases since the law's passage.
Would it surprise you that the data I have says that it's been brought 130 times since 1994? Because then my question is how many FACE Act cases have been filed in defense of abortion providers or in defense of pro-abortion activists versus how many FACE Act cases have been filed in defense of pro-life Americans or churches that have been attacked And I wonder if you know the date on those.
Well, I believe in outreach and have been aggressively conducting outreach to all groups so that the public understands that the FACE Act applies to both pro-choice and pro-life groups. And I will flag for you, Chairman, that we recently had January indictments against 2 Florida residents for spray painting threats on pregnancy resource centers.
And I certainly appreciate that you all did that, but the numbers I have are out of 130 uses of the FACE Act since 1994, 126 were for pro-abortion activists and in defense of abortion providers, and 4 have been for pro-life Americans and or churches. And I think that was one of them in January. I'd let you respond to that, and then I'm out of my time.
Well, while I can't speak to what happened in prior administrations, what I can assure you is that the division is committed to full and even-handed enforcement of this important federal law.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Mr. Cohen.
Thank you for coming before this committee, and thank you for your work and dedication to seeing that the Constitution is properly protected and that people are given the rights that are extended therefrom. Can you tell me some of the things that you've done and the Justice Department has done to improve cities' capacities to fight crime, which is a serious issue in this country today, and particularly in my city, Memphis, Tennessee?
Yes, thank you for the question, Congressman. Public safety is an important priority for the Justice Department and for our Attorney General. My colleagues in the Criminal Division, a sister component, recently launched an initiative in your city of Memphis to deal with violent crime. While I can't speak to that initiative, what I can assure you is that this Justice Department is committed to partnering and working with jurisdictions and officials to ensure public safety.
And that's a national program that started in Houston and is going to go to other cities as well.
I believe that's correct.
Thank you. And I appreciate Memphis being in a red state. You're coming and helping us with this great problem. Civil rights enforcement and the Voting Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities are 3 of my major issues. What exactly is the Department of Justice doing to enforce the Voting Rights Act? I know we've seen some actions in Alabama and in Louisiana and maybe in another one of the southern states. What have they done there, and on disability rights as well?
So, Congressman, I started off my career at the Justice Department as a voting rights lawyer, and what I can assure you is that the Civil Rights Division remains steadfast in ensuring that we're using the Voting Rights Act, National Voter Registration Act, Help America Vote Act, the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act to ensure that every eligible American has voice in our democracy. We are filing lawsuits. We are filing statements of interest in third-party lawsuits to help guide the courts on the appropriate interpretation and application of the law. We're issuing guidance documents and more, but we are without one of our most powerful tools given the suspension of the Section 5 preclearance provision following the Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder ruling.
And on disabilities?
Enforcement of the ADA is a hallmark of our work in the Civil Rights Division. Every day we're working to ensure that people with disabilities have access to jobs, housing, and we're also very mindful of the barriers that people face when it comes to web access. And so again, through litigation, through guidance, through technical assistance, and providing service to the public by way of ADA.gov and more, we are fighting to stand up for people with disabilities across our country.
That's so important, to give everybody an opportunity to have a full life and not to have some accident of nature or disease be an impediment to that, and the Justice Department's actions are great. Section 5 was eliminated by the Supreme Court. Section 2 is alive and has been used and used well, even though sometimes it's late and it takes time. Now there's an argument in the Eighth Circuit where they ruled that only the government can bring a case under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Have most of the cases that have been brought under Section 2 been brought by individuals or by the government? And if it does come out that that is upheld by the Supreme Court or ruled that it's a proper interpretation of the Voting Rights Act and the Constitution. What will that do to the voting rights enforcement in your division?
Yeah, while the Justice Department takes seriously its obligation to enforce Section 2, no doubt private parties, nonpartisan organizations have played a central role. Supreme Court precedent, legislative history, and decades of work in the courts have long made clear that private groups enjoy a private right of action under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. We weighed in this case in the Eighth Circuit and will continue to watch very closely what's playing out here.
Most of the cases brought under Section 2, have they been brought by the government? Have they been brought by private litigants?
The raw numbers probably show that the sum total of work by private groups has been larger.
Private attorney generals.
That's right, and nonpartisan organizations. They absolutely have played a critical role working alongside the government to ensure that every eligible American has voice in our democracy.
Thank you very much. And while I know your shoes are more difficult to walk in than John Lewis's, you were walking in John Lewis's shoes. And I hope at all times you will remember that and continue to enforce voting rights. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. I'll now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. As I'm sure you've surmised, the concern of many of us here involves the unequal application of the laws based on the political or ethnic identity of those involved. The chair cited many examples involving everything from acts of violence against pro-life clinics to anti-Semitic hate crimes, for example. The law is only respected if it is applied evenly. So what can you tell us to address these concerns?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I believe wholeheartedly that the division, the entire department is committed to even-handed enforcement of the law. We follow the facts and we apply the law. When it comes to hate crimes, anti-Semitic violence and standing up to anti-Semitic hate crimes is a top priority for us.
What you say and what you do seem to be very different things. For example, how many prosecutions has your division initiated against violence and vandalism by anti-abortion groups such as Jane's Revenge against anti-abortion clinics as opposed to the other way around? The chairman cited 126 prosecutions against pro-life groups and only 4 against pro-abortion groups under the FACE Act. Are these numbers correct? And if they are, how do you explain them?
While I can't speak to prior administrations, what I can tell you is that in this year alone, we've had indictments in January and March.
Well, how many prosecutions during your tenure have been initiated against pro-life groups and how many against pro-abortion groups?
Well, I provided 2 examples from
Well,
just this year.
I'm looking at the entire totality of what you're doing. I'm not cherry-picking numbers. What are the actual numbers in totality?
Well, those are 2 sets of indictments, Congressman.
Okay, you're not going to
We're
answer the
working
question. Let me go on. How many prosecutions has your division initiated against hate crimes directed against the Jewish community as opposed to those directed, say, at the Muslim community? Christopher Wray testified at a Senate hearing that religion-based hate crimes against Jewish Americans comprise 60% of all such crimes, despite there only being 2.4% of the American population. So I guess my question would be, are 60% of your religious-based hate crime prosecutions been in attacks against Jewish Americans?
Our Tree of Life prosecution
That's
this
one
year
case.
is...
I'm looking at the totality. I'm not interested in your cherry-picking one case that you've pursued. I want to know, what is the total amount? Have 60% of your prosecutions been directed against religious-based hate crimes directed at Jewish Americans?
I can provide
Yes or no?
I can provide countless examples.
I'm not looking for examples. I want the total number.
I would be
Have
happy to provide
60%
that.
of your prosecutions been against hate crimes directed at Jewish Americans? Yes or no?
I don't have the precise number, but countless examples.
Well,
I'm happy to provide
the
list.
The precise number will tell us whether you are being candid in the relationship between what you say and what you do. Another concern is that the Civil Rights Division's perceived resistance to Supreme Court decisions forbidding universities from discriminating against applicants based on their race. In the Students for Fair Admissions case, you called this, quote, a dog whistle that could invite a lot of chaos and unnecessarily create hysteria among colleges and universities who may fear that the government may come down on them for their efforts to maintain diversity on their campuses, unquote. Well, once the Supreme Court spoke clearly on this issue, your division released an advisory to universities telling them how to violate the law by, quote, linking students' applications to their race. Is the administration bound to obey the law, or is it not?
Yes, Congressman.
And how do you explain that memo?
We follow and abide by the rulings of the United States Supreme Court.
But you
and the
don't.
resource-
Your memo speaks to that. I mean, can you at least see how such a memo could be viewed as open defiance to the authority of the Supreme Court and the rule of law?
We comply with the mandate of the Supreme Court, Congressman.
But you're not. Finally, how do you see the separation of jurisdictions between local law enforcement agencies and federal law enforcement? In what cases do you believe the federal government should defer to local law enforcement agencies?
Well, we collaborate and work closely with local and state law enforcement. The tragic killing of Ahmaud Arbery is one example. The state of Georgia did not have a hate crimes law on the books at the time that Mr. Arbery was tragically killed. Our federal hate crime prosecution here was important. But every day we work to collaborate and coordinate with
How often do you defer to local law enforcement in their
often,
legitimate...
Congressman. We have limited resources and rely on local and state governments to do their part in enforcing the law.
Great. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman from California. Recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Attorney General Clark, thank you so much for being here today, your testimony, and your service to our country. I want to especially recognize the Civil Rights Division for the incredible work you all did prosecuting the self-proclaimed white nationalist who drove to my community in August 2019 to massacre Latinos and anyone who looked like an immigrant, per his confession. It was a very challenging trial for the community to relive the trauma and that horrific event, but I'm very grateful to the department for the work that you all did to ensure that my community received justice and all the victims and families received justice. So I want to thank you for that. I have raised the issue before with your department about my state, the state of Texas, and Governor Greg Abbott, and the way that he is engaging specifically in border communities like my own. And Operation Lone Star has been a project of Governor Abbott's that has essentially created some chaos in border communities like my own. High-speed chases by DPS that result in fatalities and significant property damage. But there are other violations as well: racial profiling, due process violations, unlawful detention of migrants without charges being filed, and I could go on and on with the impact that Operation Lone Star has had in Texas. Ms. Clark, will you commit to a review of whether federal funding sources are being used to support Operation Lone Star and whether such support violates the Civil Rights Act?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We continue to monitor Operation Lone Star, and yes, we can commit to doing that.
Wonderful, thank you. There is a growing group of legislators, policymakers, not just in Texas, but outside of Texas, sounding the alarm, so I really appreciate that. If advocates, members of the public, or migrants themselves perceive a federal civil rights violation inflicted by a Texas public official under Operation Lone Star or otherwise, to whom at the Department of Justice should they report this to?
We encourage the public to bring forward complaints about law enforcement misconduct to the FBI. The Civil Rights Division works closely with the FBI to investigate allegations of misconduct.
Thank you so much. I also want to sound the alarm about a new bill that was passed by the Texas State Legislature, SB 4. And SB 4 is essentially Texas' effort to usurp federal immigration law with the creation of a new state-level immigration law. I believe, and many civil rights advocates believe, this will increase the racial profiling that is happening in Texas, and that it is unconstitutional. Are you aware of SB 4 in Texas?
Very generally, and I'm happy to take a closer look, Congresswoman.
Thank you. I think it's going to be really important. I'm not sure if the governor has signed it yet. We have urged the governor not to sign it. It is pretty brazenly and blatantly unconstitutional, but if he does sign it, if there is such, maybe not referring to this law in particular, but if there were such a law that usurped federal immigration law, what could we expect from the department?
When we identify violations of the law, we prosecute. Just by way of example, Congresswoman, earlier this year, we indicted a member of the Border Patrol for engaging in misconduct. So we take seriously these allegations, and where the law authorizes, we will prosecute.
In terms of a state, though, if a state legislature and a governor pass and sign a law that is blatantly unconstitutional, what would the department do?
If appropriate, we could file suit challenging the constitutionality of the law, but here we would have to look more closely and carefully.
Okay, I welcome that review and that scrutiny. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady from Texas, and now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Ms. Clark, in the the Missouri versus Biden case in the district court, the court explained, quote, if the allegations made by the plaintiffs are true, the present case arguably involves the most massive attack on free speech in United States history, close quote. Court went on to find that the plaintiffs were reasonably likely to succeed on the merits at trial, entered a preliminary injunction. The Fifth Circuit has affirmed. The Supreme Court has taken jurisdiction of the case. Of course, that's all civil litigation. Is any criminal investigation or prosecution of the persons responsible for that activity in the FBI, CISA, and at the White House and their co-conspirators underway in the Civil Rights Division?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with this litigation, but happy to bring your question back.
Thank you. So let me just make sure I understand that. You are not aware of the Missouri versus Biden litigation that is currently being taken up by the United States Supreme Court. Is that correct?
Unfortunately, I'm not, Congressman.
Well, assuming that you're not aware of that, what reason would there be that the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department's leader is unaware of what a United States District Court has described as the most massive attack on free speech in the United States history?
If you could share more of the facts, that could be helpful, Congressman.
Otherwise, you just don't know. Is that correct?
That's correct. Unfortunately, this does not appear to be a case that I'm familiar with.
Well, good enough. I'm going to yield the balance of my time to the chairman.
Is the gentleman from Ohio?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I find that to be astounding. I do want to follow up on the line of questioning with the gentleman from California with respect to the FACE Act implementation, because Ms. Clark, you dismissed saying, well, I can't.
Whose time are we doing now?
Go ahead, Mr. Bishop.
It's my time. I'll let the gentleman.
That's what
I may ask
for.
to
Where
send
were we
to the gentleman from Ohio after you. But
I just wanted to point out that there have been at least 35 cases of the FACE Act being applied to pro-life groups and or churches, or pro-life people that are anti-abortion. in your tenure, not even counting 2021. That's the data from 2022 and 2023 versus the 4 that we can point to, the 1 that you point to in January. So the point, gentleman from California, I would just ask, you're in your possession of your hands. You had a FOIA request that was responded to from a left-leaning group, the Center for Investigative Reporting. We've been asking for a copy of that FOIA about the prosecution levels and the numbers from your office for a long time, I think for almost a year, and we've not been responded to. So will you commit to sharing that FOIA request and all of the data of FACE Act prosecutions, specifically under your watch and generally?
I can absolutely bring this back to the division's FOIA officials and ensure that you receive a timely response. Please know that the division is committed to even-handed enforcement of the
But
FACE Act.
even under your watch, it's at least 35 to 1 or 2. That is not even-handed. It's far from even-handed. And importantly, Mark Houck, who was targeted, had a raid of his home, prosecuted under this, was acquitted by a jury. Have you apologized to him on behalf of the Department of Justice for that grave violation of his civil rights, having his family have to watch him being raided at his home, and then he's acquitted by a federal jury? Have you apologized to him?
Well, we follow the facts and apply the law. That is our job, and we welcome opportunities to engage with other pro-life groups that may be experiencing threats or acts of
The answer to
violence.
that is no. Does the
Reclaiming my time, I yield to the gentleman from Ohio, Madam Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'm like, I think every member, at least on this side, but I would think every member, anyone watching, is just astounded that you are not familiar. The Assistant Attorney General for the Division of Civil Rights at the Justice Department is not familiar with a huge case, Missouri v. Biden, where in that case, I think it was 6 different federal agencies were found to be guilty of violating the First Amendment liberties of Americans, HHS, NIAID, FBI, DOJ, DHS, even the White House itself, and you are not familiar with that, is truly... frankly, I don't know what I think that's why the gentleman had time to yield back, because he didn't know what I don't know what we say. That is it's in front of the Supreme Court, and the head of Civil Rights Division doesn't know. That is scary. And if that doesn't in and of itself show that this Justice Department is political and doing things for political reasons, I do not know what does. I yield back, and I appreciate the gentleman's question.
I yield my time.
I think the gentleman from North Carolina and the gentleman from Ohio, the gentlelady from Vermont is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Assistant Attorney General Clark, thanks so much for being here. And I wanted to start by just personally thanking the Justice Department for its work regarding the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh on October 27th, 2018. As you know, this heinous act of anti-Semitism took the lives of 11 Jewish Americans, and I just want to thank the DOJ for all the work there. And it's clear that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is tragically on the rise, both around the globe and here in our own country. And my home state of Vermont is not immune. In Burlington over Thanksgiving, 3 young Palestinian Americans were shot as they simply walked down the street. Hisham, Kinan, and Tassin spoke a mix of Arabic and English, and 2 wore traditional keffiyehs. And although the investigation will determine whether this horrible crime will meet the legal definition of a hate crime, we know, and I say we, all Vermonters know, that this was a hateful act. Now, this act of violence is part of a disturbing and frightening trend, and all of us need to remember that we have a part to play in standing with and speaking out against against violence against our Muslim neighbors. And recently, Attorney General Garland stated that the FBI and ATF are investigating the incident, including whether the attack constituted a hate crime. Now, I know that you cannot discuss specifics of the work, but I'm wondering if you can please let us know the Civil Rights Division work as it relates to the investigation of hate crimes. I think Vermonters would love to know.
Right. The Justice Department, in particular the FBI and ATF, are currently working with local and state law enforcement and looking into this very, very tragic matter. We have been incredibly vigilant since the October 7th tragedy that has unfolded in Israel and in the Middle East. anti-Semitic violence, Islamophobic violence, and the targeting of communities perceived to be Jewish or Muslim has no place in our society. We will take seriously investigations of threats of violence, acts of violence, and prosecute where appropriate.
And so have you seen an increase in actual or potential anti-Semitic or Islamophobic incidents since October 7th?
We have engaged with many organizations, Jewish organizations, Muslim organizations, all of whom are reporting that they themselves are seeing an uptick. We rely on the FBI data, which comes out annually, but everything that we are hearing from groups makes clear that this is a moment that requires vigilance on the part of the federal government, and so that's what we're doing.
And follow up, what steps specifically is the Civil Rights Division doing to keep Jewish Americans and Arab Americans, Muslim Americans safe in their communities? I know that there is just growing anxiety and fear about basic safety and security. I'm wondering if you could just give us a few more details about what the department can do and is doing.
We're using the tools that Congress gave us, laws like the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act to hold perpetrators accountable. We realize we can't prosecute our way out of the crisis, and so we've also worked to institute programs like United Against Hate, where every single U.S. Attorney's Office across the country, all 94, have instituted programs bringing together local, state, federal law enforcement, community groups, and faith leaders to ensure that folks know how to investigate and report hate incidents and hate crimes. We're also engaged with training of prosecutors and training of law enforcement, and then there's the grant making that happens as well. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment at the Justice Department to confront the hate crisis that we're up against, and we stand for and behind all communities that are targeted by hate.
I really appreciate that. My last question, I know I have a lot of time. What measures are being taken, this is another topic, what measures are being taken to address discriminatory practices in the provision of gender-affirming care?
We here too are being very vigilant. We've seen a number of states that have adopted bans and restrictions on gender-affirming care. We are very wary of the fact that Justice Gorsuch himself noted in the Bostock ruling that discrimination against transgender people is discrimination based on sex. And so we've brought lawsuits and issued statements of interest challenging some of the state laws that we have seen restricting access to care for transgender youth.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady from Vermont. I now recognize the Judiciary Committee Chairman, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Clark, are you sure you don't know anything about Missouri v. Biden? You don't know anything about that case?
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. This is a case being handled by our civil division, and I assure you, Chairman, that the Justice Department...
Have you read the opinion?
The Justice Department is compliant.
No, I didn't ask that. Did you read the opinion, either from the Western District of Louisiana or the Fifth Circuit opinion?
I gleaned the ruling, but it's not a Civil Rights Division case.
Well, which is
Chairman.
it? Because, first of all, when Mr. Bishop asked, you said you didn't know one darn thing about it. Now you're saying you gleaned or you glanced or what?
I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. The Civil Division is handling this case, and the Department is compliant with the court's
Well, First Amendment rights
injunction.
are pretty fundamental rights. That's something you don't think the Civil Rights Division should be involved in. This is censorship.
Absolutely, Chairman. The First
So you're
Amendment
not?
is a bedrock principle of our democracy.
Let me go a little different route then. Do politics drive the decisions at the Justice Department today?
Politics have no place in the work of the Civil Rights Division.
3 months
or the
ago,
Justice
3 months
Department.
ago, the New Mexico governor announced a 30-day ban on citizens' right to carry a concealed firearm in Albuquerque and the county that Albuquerque sits in. What did the Justice Department do when the governor did that unconstitutional order? What did the DOJ do in response to that unconstitutional action from the governor of New Mexico?
I am generally aware of the matter that you are referring to, but gun control is not a core issue that we handle.
Second
in the
Amendment, a
Civil Rights
fundamental right
Division.
like the First Amendment, it's pretty important, isn't it?
These are very important issues to the department.
Well, tell me what the Justice Department did when this happened, when the governor imposed this unconstitutional ban.
I'm happy to bring your question back to my colleagues.
You don't know that one either.
The criminal division and the civil
You
division.
don't know about Missouri v. Biden. You don't know what the DOJ did in response to the governor of New Mexico's action. Well, here's what the county sheriff said. He held a press conference saying that this thing was unconstitutional, unenforceable, and incapable of stopping and curbing gun violence. The New Mexico Attorney General, who's a Democrat, said this thing will not have any impact on public safety and does not pass constitutional muster. So when the Democrat Attorney General of New Mexico said it doesn't fit the Constitution, but you guys at DOJ don't do a darn thing? Is that what you're telling me?
Politics have no place in the work of the Justice Department, Chairman, but...
Are you aware of anything the Justice Department did to that unconstitutional order from the governor of New Mexico?
Not in the Civil Rights Division, Chairman, but I can certainly
Roder,
bring your
you're an
question.
important person in the Justice Department. Did the Justice Department do anything?
Yes, we enforce the laws that Congress gave us, Chairman.
No, in this case, did the Justice Department do anything?
I will bring that question back to
I'll
my
give you the answer.
colleagues.
They didn't. They didn't file an amicus. They didn't put any statement of interest. They didn't do a darn thing, which gets back to the point I think Mr. McClintock was making earlier. It shows, I think, how political you are, because when Texas passed a pro-life bill on September 1st, 2021, 8 days later, the Department of Justice announces an investigation into that bill. Now, this is what amazes me. That's a bill that actually passed the state House, passed the state Senate, was signed by the governor, and you guys are in there contesting that 8 days later. But you have something in New Mexico, which is an obvious direct assault on the Second Amendment, and it's an order from the governor. It didn't go through the legislature. The governor does it, and the Department of Justice does nothing.
The Civil Rights Division is deeply committed to enforcing the laws that this body gave us and committed to standing up for the rights, the civil rights of all Americans, Chairman.
Well, you can say it, but based on some of your other answers, not knowing the first thing about Missouri v. Biden, not knowing what, if anything, was done, because nothing was actually done, relative to the governor's unconstitutional order regarding New Mexico citizens and residents and Americans' Second Amendment rights. This is why we're so darn concerned. I appreciate the chairman having this hearing. With that, I got 38 seconds. I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Arizona.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And I just want to ask this, because I'm over here. So, sorry. You answered a previous question saying that if the governor did something, they were talking about Texas, the representative did not like the Texas law regarding immigration. You said that you guys, the Civil Rights Division, we could file a lawsuit. Well, a lawsuit was filed in the case that the chairman was talking about, but you guys did not participate in that.
Yep.
Do you disregard Second Amendment rights? Is that not important? And if a governor violates those laws, those rights directly, is that not important enough for the Civil Rights Division to get involved in?
So I understand that the New Mexico order was enjoined within 2 days of entry, but I did want to make clear that gun control is not an area that the Civil Rights Division, under any administration, has historically worked much around. It is an important, the Second Amendment, of course, is an important part of our Constitution, Congressman.
So, just a quick follow-up. I mean, so what you're telling us that Civil Rights Division will not protect Second Amendment rights?
We enforce the laws that Congress gave us, and weighing in on Second Amendment and gun control issues across any administration has never been a core aspect of the division's work.
All right. Gentleman's time has expired. I will recognize Ms. Bush.
Thank you. St. Louis and I are here today to continue our efforts to hold our government to its highest ideals, including equal justice under law. Assistant Attorney General Clark, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
And thank you for your career of public service in support of civil rights for all people. I was excited to see your nomination and your confirmation to this role, and I do believe that you are doing your best to advance the cause of justice inside the government. And as an activist from the Ferguson Frontline to Congress, I just want to say thank you for your work. But as I have said before many times, including to Attorney General Garland when he was here in September, I think that the department can do more to advance civil rights and the rule of law. These problems, of course, are system-wide, and they predate your time at Justice. So I want to ask Assistant Attorney General Clark, the Civil Rights Division handles cases that involve law enforcement misconduct and the violation of federal rights, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I strongly believe the actions of Georgia law enforcement regarding the killing of a protester named Torgy Tita and the suppression of opposition to the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center, or is also known Cop City, are obvious examples of law enforcement misconduct resulting in the violation of federal rights. And I urge the Civil Rights Division to open an investigation. What's happening in Atlanta can happen anywhere in the country, and we need the DOJ to do your part in preventing that from happening. Another issue I want to follow up on is the department's enforcement of Title VI and the anti-discrimination provisions of the Safe Streets Act. This vital law makes clear that the department has an obligation to ensure the recipients of funding do not engage in discrimination like what we've seen in my district, which includes Ferguson, Missouri, and as detailed by the DOJ's 2015 pattern and practice investigation following the police killing of Michael Brown. I was glad to see the commitments that Associate Attorney General Gupta announced in June 2022 that strengthened the enforcement of the Title VI provisions, and we've had that conversation, but I have yet to see any meaningful progress by the department in implementing any of them. So do you have any updates for the committee about the department's implementation of these commitments?
If I could flag one area, Congresswoman, it would be environmental justice, where we have made historic accomplishments in using Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to stand up for communities that are beleaguered by environmental injustice problems. Houston, Texas, and Lowndes County, Alabama are two examples of places where we have, for the very first time, used Title VI to address issues that disproportionately impact Black and Latino communities when it comes to environmental justice.
All right, thank you for that. One final issue I want to raise with you is conditions at local prisons and jails. I have been demanding answers about the horrific conditions at the St. Louis City Justice Center in my district, where yet another incarcerated person died this weekend. I know your team has investigated conditions at jails in South Carolina and elsewhere, and I would just love to speak with you more about this issue. We must not forget the humanity of people who are incarcerated. And in my closing, let me just say this. We know we can't prosecute our way to justice, but the Civil Rights Division is the crown jewel of the department, and for good reason. I know that there are people in the division who want to use the law to stop discrimination instead of enabling it, to stop police brutality and the suppression of legitimate protest and dissent instead of enabling it, to stop the relentless and inhumane attack on our LGBTQ communities instead of enabling it. That is the work of the Civil Rights Division. It's what you've done, and I know it's what you'll continue to do, despite the efforts of the right-wing extremists to strip away our civil rights and make discrimination the actual law of the land. We won't let those efforts succeed. Assistant Attorney General Clark, thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you do in support of equality and justice for all. I am your ally in this work, and I look forward to partnering with you as we continue on in our shared priorities. And in my final few seconds that I have left, plus the last one went over a little bit, so I think I have a little bit more time. If there is anything else that you would like to speak to or clear up that has been said.
Thank you, Congresswoman. People do not abandon their civil and constitutional rights at the jailhouse door. I'm glad that you brought up jail conditions. Our enforcement of the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act is an important priority for us. You noted our recent investigation opened in South Carolina. We're also investigating prison conditions in Georgia. Texas, where we're looking at juvenile detention facilities, Parchman in Mississippi, New Jersey, and more. Such an important area of enforcement for this Justice Department Civil Rights Division.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bush. Mr. Fry.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield to you such time as you may consume.
I appreciate that. I just have one quick question, then I'll let him yield to the gentleman from Arizona. With respect to the question you just talked about in terms of jails and how people are treated in incarceration, have you all done any investigation into how those that were charged with crimes related to January 6th have been treated in the jails in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, Chairman, there is one matter that was referred to us by a judge in the D.C. District Court, and we did respond to the judge's inquiry.
Have you all
there.
conducted an investigation into the treatment of those facilities? And if so, can you produce that information and report to us?
While we have investigations open across the country, we don't presently have one open in the District of Columbia.
I would yield back to Mr. Fry.
I yield to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
Thank you. I want to just, before we continue our conversation we were having about New Mexico, I want to just provide context regarding the FACE Act and the prosecution disparity, which looks like it's almost 16-1. Pro-life people are prosecuted 16 times to 1. It is important to put in context that since the Dobbs case was leaked, there's been over 100 attacks on pro-life centers, birthing centers, and churches. And so that makes the numbers even more disparate and creates a perception of bias here. But I want to go back to some of the things you said. You said in your opening that, quote, we protect the civil rights of every American, close quote. Your job is to enforce the Constitution. Even-handed enforcement in applying the law. Those are things that you said. And then, again, in the Texas question that you were given, because the representative on the other side was upset because the legislature and the governor enacted a law that she felt was unconstitutional, blatantly unconstitutional with regard to immigration law. And she said, what can you do? And you said, we could file suit. That's a quote, we could file suit. So the reason that I bring that up is because when I asked you, and when the chairman was asking you about, did you file an amicus, did you file a statement of interest with vis-a-vis the governor of New Mexico's abridgment of the Second Amendment rights of New Mexicans by saying in Bernalillo County, you can't carry a handgun outside of your home, you said, well, we enforce the laws that Congress passes and enacts. And so I wanted to ask you then, after I heard that, and we ran out of time, was if the Texas law is dealing with immigration border security issues, and you said we could file a lawsuit, has Congress enacted a law that would allow you to even investigate border security issues?
No, Congressman, and I just want, Congress has not given the Civil Rights Division clear authority or direction to file civil suits regarding the possession of firearms.
Yeah, no,
ATF.
But you told us that you could file a lawsuit vis-a-vis a state trying to enforce its border because they're being overrun.
Oh,
are you telling me that you find some statutory authority for that?
Only if there is a violation of a federal law that Congress has put on the books that the division is tasked with enforcing. That would be a very critical qualifier. So
in this particular instance, then, what you're telling me is when the Second Amendment is directly being violated in such a way that you're right, there was an injunction almost immediately put in place because why a private action was brought and y'all never weighed into it. DOJ never, not just your division, but nobody from DOJ ever weighed into it. You're saying that you couldn't go forward with that, and I find that absolutely astonishing, quite frankly. And I'm going to now submit before I run out of time. I'm sorry to take up all this time, but for the record, document an article: troopers who fatally shot a Cop City activist near Atlanta won't be charged, prosecutor says, wherein it discloses that the individual shot at the police 4 times before fire was returned.
Without objection.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Arizona. I would now yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair. Madam Assistant Attorney General, you received some questions about conditions in the DC jail, which we've heard increasingly from many of our colleagues on the right since January 6th. Isn't it true that the DC jail had deplorable conditions for decades before January 2021?
Well, I can't speak to formal findings. What I can say is that with more resources, we could certainly do more. We want jails and prisons that comply with the Constitution and that comply with the mandate of the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act.
Thank you. And I would just ask unanimous consent to enter a Time magazine article from January 2022 entitled "The Crisis at the DC Jail Began Decades Before January 6 Defendants Started Raising Concerns." Unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Thank you. Yes, I had reason to work with the Washington Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights on those issues when it was primarily a minority population in that jail, and the concerns had been raised for quite some time. In the wake of the 2020 election, we've seen a surge in lawsuits and other actions to challenge election results without evidence of fraud or misconduct, but they seem to have been fueled by the lies of the former president and other election deniers. These election challenges are not without cost. They undermine confidence in our elections without grounds, and they have cost taxpayers millions of dollars in overtime, legal fees, et cetera. And we've also seen a rise in attacks and threats against our election officials. This is particularly so in Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, where I live and represent, and which is a perennial battleground state. So the counties that I represent have been subjected to dozens of groundless election challenges in recent years, including following our recent municipal elections. So what can the Department of Justice do to help states and localities address these attacks on our election systems, and what guidance can be provided with respect to audits, et cetera?
Well, there has been an elections threats task force that has been launched that includes representation from across the department, including our criminal division. Threats and violence, acts of violence have no place in our political discourse, and that task force is open to hear from people who want to bring forth meritorious complaints.
Thank you. We've had some conversation today about how the Department of Justice is helping our cities fight crime and provide lawful policing. I'm very grateful for the COPS grants that many of my jurisdictions have recently received. Can you talk about some of the things that your department is doing to help our communities implement 21st century policing practices in a way that keeps everyone safe?
Well, thank you for the question. We work on a range of issues. We work cooperatively, for example, with law enforcement to make sure that they can provide language access to communities that are limited English proficient. We take seriously our obligation to address misconduct when it arises. The chair noted a number of our pattern and practice investigations that have been opened in cities such as Memphis, Louisville, the Louisiana State Police, Phoenix, and more. These represent an infinitesimal number of the 18,000 plus law enforcement agencies across our country, but are important investigations because we want public safety and we want policing that is bias-free and that comports with the standards of the Constitution. I engage with organizations such as the International Association of Chiefs of Police and believe that training and grant making are also important ways in which the department is working to support law enforcement.
And I know that's true from my conversations with many of our smaller police departments that are seeking funding and resources to help them gain accreditation so that their officers are well-trained and able to handle whatever is thrown at them. We have, there have just been a couple things here I want to correct for the record. There have been some mischaracterization of statistics. One of them was suggesting that there's been a disproportionate number of these pattern and practice investigations started under your leadership, but of course that's in contrast to the fact that the prior administration had eliminated the use of pattern and practice consent decrees. So I wanted to mention that. Also, there's been an attempt to contrast the number of FACE Act prosecutions that have occurred since the FACE Act was passed in 1994. Of course, it's really important to note that it was passed in response to murders and physical attacks upon abortion care providers. That was the genesis of that act. So it is not surprising that there have been more prosecutions that have taken place with respect to people physically attacking and murdering abortion care providers. And I commend the fact that you are even-handedly applying that when anyone, for whatever reason, provides takes action against someone who is providing reproductive health care. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley.
I yield to the chair.
Mr. Kiley, the chair of the Judiciary Committee.
Oh, to the chair of the Judiciary Committee.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Kiley.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Ms. Clark, who's Ava Edel?
Chairman, that is not a name that I'm familiar with.
Well, I'll try to familiarize you with her. She is an 87-year-old pro-life advocate who survived a communist concentration camp in Yugoslavia after World War II that you guys have charged under the FACE Act for praying and singing in front of an abortion clinic. Is that the best use of the Justice Department's time and energy?
As noted, the FACE Act has been is a law that this body passed in response to efforts to obstruct access to reproductive health clinics, threats of violence, acts of violence. We follow the facts and apply the law without fear or favor, Chairman.
Really? I think we've heard a lot of that today about how if you're pro-life, you get the full treatment. Just ask Ava Edel, 87-year-old concentration camp survivor. But if you're on the other side, after the Dobbs decision, it's a different issue. In spite of what you said, that you apply it equally across the board. How about your decision to file a lawsuit against SpaceX? Can you talk to me about that?
Yes, Chairman.
Let me ask it this way first. Did Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter have anything to do with the Justice Department's decision to file that lawsuit against SpaceX?
The investigation into SpaceX was open during the last administration, and we filed an administrative action under the Immigration and Nationality Act, an important law passed by this body with bipartisan support and signed into law by President Reagan.
So what are you alleging that SpaceX did wrong?
In this case, we allege that the company is not compliant with the anti-discrimination provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act. This is a law that has been—
What are they discriminating against?
Here they are discriminating against people who have received refugee and asylum status by our federal courts under the INA.
They're discriminating against refugees and asylum seekers, is that right?
No, Chairman, against people who have received refugee status and asylum status by our federal courts and who enjoy equal standing under federal law to U.S. citizens and naturalized citizens. The law requires equal treatment of these individuals.
You're saying that SpaceX did not hire, is that appropriate, did not hire enough refugees or people who've been granted asylum? Is that what you're asserting in the lawsuit?
And that they discourage those people from applying for any job, whether it's for a custodial position, office clerk, someone who works in a kitchen facility, all the way up through engineering.
So you're suing, I just want to cut to the chase. You're suing SpaceX because they hired too many Americans, too many citizens, not enough people who are refugees or people who've been granted asylum.
This investigation—
And you waited to sue. This investigation started 3 years ago. I know the facts. It started 3 years ago. And yet you bring the lawsuit after Mr. Musk purchases Twitter, now X. Is that right?
We apply the laws that this body gave us without fear or favor.
And Mr. Musk, his assertion is that they're dealing with national security type information at SpaceX, and that's why he's even posted this before you brought the lawsuit. He said this, that's why they focus on hiring people who have a green card or are American citizens. And you guys say this is something we need to go after SpaceX because they're not hiring enough Americans, and we need to charge Ava Edel, 87-year-old concentration camp survivor. That's what the Justice Department and the Biden administration needs to do. But oh, by the way, we don't know anything about Missouri v. Biden. We didn't weigh in on the issue where a governor of a state told the citizens, they're American citizens, you cannot exercise your Second Amendment rights contrary to the law, contrary to what the Supreme Court has said. And you're trying to tell us today that the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department is not political. Frankly, I find it almost laughable that you're making that argument because anyone with common sense and any objectivity can see you guys are definitely political. With that I yield back and thank the gentleman who's left for yielding time.
Well, I thank the Judiciary Committee Chairman. I would like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from Mr. Paul Teller, the Executive Director of Advancing American Freedom, to Attorney General Garland, Secretary Cardona, that is noting the significant spike in anti-Semitic vandalism, harassment, and violence across the United States, and asking the Department of Justice, Department of Education, who have expansive jurisdiction, particularly Civil Rights Division, over these matters, to ensure that they're following up on that is signed by numerous groups across the country. Without objection, entered in the record. Now recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hagman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Assistant Attorney General Clark, on October 12th, the DOJ and CFPB issued a joint statement on fair lending and credit opportunities for non-citizen borrowers under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. I sent you a letter on this joint statement on November 6th, but have yet to receive a response. As you know, the Civil Rights Division enforces the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and you are quoted in the press release issued for this guidance, which warns banks not to use immigration status, including whether an individual is lawfully present in the country, to determine the ability to take out a loan. Yet the joint statement admits the Equal Credit Opportunity Act does not expressly prohibit consideration of immigration status. This appears to be an attempt to dissuade our financial institutions from considering all legally permitted factors to ascertain a creditor's rights regarding payment, which could cause very severe damage to our financial institutions. Seems to me that your division and the CFPB are attempting to go beyond the intent of Congress and are using implied threats to further this administration's failed immigration policies, which are only making the situation at the southern border even worse. Ms. Clark, what authority do you have to instruct financial institutions on this matter, especially considering your statement explicitly admits that ECOA does not prohibit the consideration of immigration status?
Thank you, Congresswoman. As noted in the letter that we issued with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the law contemplates that a person's immigration status, often in conjunction with other factors, could be relevant to determining repayment prospects, but more...
Well, if considering immigration status is permitted by the law, what was the purpose of issuing this joint statement?
To clarify simply what the law that Congress gave us requires. It's an area where people have sought clarity.
Okay. Is it this administration's position that financial institutions are required to loan money to illegal aliens?
No.
Okay. When can I expect a response to my letter?
I will consult with our Office of Legislative Affairs to ensure that you receive a response, Congresswoman.
Including to all of the questions that I've asked?
Yes, we'll work with our Office of Legislative Affairs to respond.
Have you been contacted by any financial institutions about this statement?
No, Congresswoman.
Have you taken any steps to ensure that these financial institutions are aware of what the law actually says?
Yes, this is a document intended to provide clarity. There are institutions who have sought clarity and want to ensure that they are following the law and not running afoul of the law in this
Have you taken
area.
any actions against any financial institutions for turning down illegal aliens for loans?
No.
All right. What additional action pertaining to this joint statement have you and the Civil Rights Division taken?
Well, our partners at CFPB, for example, recently took action against...
In what way?
Against an institution that engaged
For
in
what purpose?
discrimination based on national origin in violation of the law.
Is that a pending case right now?
It is a recent settlement, a recent resolution secured by CFPB. At the Civil Rights Division, we're committed to ensuring that banks and lenders are not engaged in redlining or engaged in any conduct that
But you're
might-
also not trying to force them to loan to illegal aliens when they can take that factor into consideration to determine who may be entitled to a loan. Is that correct?
We want a healthy economy with banks that comply with the letter.
But you're not going to violate the law to do that, are you?
No.
Okay, thank you. With that, I yield my remaining time to the chair.
Thank the gentlelady from Wyoming. Ms. Clark, when you were a private citizen, not in the position you were in April of 2020, there was a protest in front of the Texas State Capitol building. I've got a video I'm looking at right now. It's actually right under my old office when I worked for Governor Rick Perry, sitting in the front of the Texas Capitol building. There was people, Americans gathered, Texans, chanting, "Fire Fauci." You tweeted, quote, "These people should be publicly identified and named, barred from treatment at any public hospital if and when they fall ill, and denied coverage under their insurance," end quote. That is a tweet. Now, earlier I asked you to repudiate the statement about defunding police, and you neither repudiated nor, I think, stood by it. I think you obfuscated around it. My question to you, as the head of the Civil Rights Division, so it was civil rights, civil liberties of the United Americans, you said these people should be publicly identified and named, barred from treatment at any public hospital if and when they fall ill, and denied coverage under their insurance for chanting "Fire Fauci." Does the gentlelady stand by that statement?
I believe that every American should have access to health care in our country. I don't know the context for that statement. I imagine it was issued during the heat of the pandemic, but Chair, I sit before you with a commitment to ensuring that all Americans are treated fairly and equally under the law.
So I'll take that as a no to standing by that statement. Similarly to the statement earlier in the hearing. But with that, that concludes today's hearing. We thank you, Ms. Clark, for appearing before the committee. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. Without objection, this hearing is adjourned.